The night Sarah left, it was raining so hard that the sky itself seemed to be crying. She moved through the long stone corridors of the Alpha King's palace with quiet steps, careful not to make a sound. Her heart was beating fast, but her mind was steady. She had planned this moment for weeks. She knew which guard took his break at midnight. She knew which side gate had a loose lock. She knew exactly how many steps it took to reach the outer wall without passing a single torch. She was 21 years old. She had nothing in her hands except a small cloth bag with a change of clothes, a piece of bread, and a silver coin her mother had pressed into her palm the day she was brought to this palace. Her mother had said nothing when she gave it to her. She didn't need to. Some things are understood without words. Sarah was not a prisoner. That was the cruelest part. She had been brought to the palace of Alpha King Calum Drax as his chosen mate. A great honor, according to everyone around her. The women in her home pack had cried tears of joy. The elders had treated her family with sudden new respect. People who had never noticed her before suddenly smiled at her on the street. But Sarah had looked into Calum's eyes the night he claimed her at the gathering, and she had seen something that made the warmth drain from her face. It was not cruelty exactly. It was something colder than cruelty. It was certainty, the unshakable belief of a man who had never been told no, who had never been asked what he thought, who simply decided things and expected the world to arrange itself around his decisions. She had spent 4 months inside his palace, long enough to see how things worked, long enough to watch other women learn how to make themselves smaller, quieter, easier to be around, long enough to understand that no one in that palace was going to help her, because no one in that palace believed she needed help. So she helped herself. The gate creaked once. She held her breath. The guard at the far end of the outer path did not turn. She slipped through, walked calmly into the tree line beyond the palace walls, and kept walking until the lights of the palace disappeared behind her. She walked for most of that night in the rain. She did not cry. There would be time for that later, perhaps, but not now. Now she simply moved, one foot in front of the other, in the direction of south, where the mountains gave way to lowlands, and the lowlands led to territories that were not under Calum's direct control. She had studied the maps in the palace library. She had a good memory. She used it. By the time the sun came up, she was already far away. She renamed herself Sarah Vale, just 2 words, and a whole new life. The Ashenvale region was not a place people went to by choice. It sat at the southern edge of the Wolf territories, a rough and uneven land where 4 small packs had been fighting over resources and boundaries for as long as anyone could remember. There was no single leader. There was no peace. There were only arguments and grudges and the low hum of permanent tension that made every interaction feel like it might turn into something worse at any moment. Sarah arrived there with nothing, and she found work as a healer. She had learned about plants and medicine from her grandmother, who had been a quiet woman with steady hands and extraordinary patience. Sarah had inherited both the knowledge and the patience. She set up a small practice in a border town that sat between 2 of the rival packs, a place where both sides occasionally needed help, but neither fully claimed. It was the perfect position for someone who wanted to be useful without drawing too much attention. She watched. That was something she had always done well, watching, listening, collecting information the way other people collected objects. She watched how the 4-pack leaders spoke to each other. She noticed who was actually afraid and who was actually angry. She learned which disputes were about land and which were really about something much older and harder to name. She sat with injured wolves from both sides and treated them equally, and in doing so, she became, without ever announcing it, someone that both sides trusted. A year into her time in Ashenvale, she was asked to sit in on a meeting between 2 of the packs to help translate a misunderstanding. She agreed. The meeting had been heading toward disaster when Sarah quietly pointed out that both sides were asking for the same thing using different words. Everyone in the room went silent. Then, slowly, the leaders began to actually talk to each other. That was the first time people in Ashenvale looked at her and thought, she is different. The next 3 years were built on moments like that, one after another. She brokered agreements. She helped build a shared water system between 2 packs who had been fighting over a river. She helped resolve an old land dispute by suggesting a boundary that neither side had considered, but both could accept. She never pushed herself forward. She let ideas speak for themselves. She gave credit to others whenever she could. The 4 packs of Ashenvale had never stood together. In the spring of Sarah's 4th year there, they did. It was not a dramatic moment. It happened in a small meeting hall with a leaky roof and mismatched chairs. The 4-pack leaders signed a shared agreement, and then they all looked at Sarah and said, quietly and without ceremony, that she should lead what they had just built. She told them she would think about it overnight. She sat alone on the hillside that evening and looked at the region she had quietly, carefully built herself into. She thought about who she had been when she arrived, a woman with no name, no pack, no title, and nothing but a silver coin, and the knowledge of exactly how much strength it had taken to walk away from a life that looked like everything, but felt like nothing. She said yes the next morning. She named the territory the Ember Kingdom, not because it sounded grand, but because embers are what remain after a fire, small, quiet, and capable of becoming something much larger when given the right conditions. She was right about that. Over the next 4 years, the Ember Kingdom became something that no one in the Wolf territories had expected or could quite explain. It was not the largest territory, it was not the oldest, it did not have the most warriors or the most land. What it had was something rarer: trust. The people of the Ember Kingdom trusted their leader, and because they trusted her, they worked hard. They built strong trade networks with neighboring regions. They trained their warriors well, but used them rarely. They invested in healers and teachers and craftspeople. They resolved disputes quickly and fairly. Other territories began to notice. Pack leaders who had once ignored Ashenvale started requesting meetings. Trade agreements were signed. Alliances were formed on Sarah's terms, fair, clear, and always with a clause that protected the smaller party. She had a gift for making people feel that an agreement was good for them, because she made sure it actually was. By the time 7 years had passed since she walked out of Calem's palace gate in the rain, the Ember Kingdom was widely considered the strongest wolf nation in the known territories. Not the biggest, not the loudest, the strongest, in the way that actually matters, which is the kind of strength that holds up under pressure. Sarah was 28 years old. She lived in a modest stone building that her people called a palace, though she had never asked them to call it that. She had a small garden outside her office window, where she grew the same herbs she had learned from her grandmother. She still worked long hours. She still listened more than she spoke. She had not thought about Calem Drax in years, or so she told herself. He arrived at her border on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, alone and without announcement. The border guards recognized him immediately, of course. Everyone knew what Calem Drax looked like. He was tall, with dark hair going gray at the edges now, and the kind of stillness that powerful people sometimes have, the stillness of someone who has never had to be in a hurry because the world has always waited for him. Except the world was no longer waiting. His kingdom, once considered untouchable, had been struggling for 3 years. Trade routes that had depended on fear rather than genuine goodwill had collapsed when neighboring territories stopped being afraid. 2 of his oldest vassal packs had left his authority quietly, without confrontation, and he had let them go because he no longer had a strong enough reason to make them stay. His council had sent him to the Ember Kingdom to negotiate a trade alliance. That was the official reason. Sarah received him in her meeting room, a plain space with a long wooden table, good lighting, and a view of the garden. She did not make him wait. She did not put on a show. She simply walked in, sat down across from him, folded her hands on the table, and looked at him with calm, clear eyes. Calem had prepared himself for many things. He had prepared for anger. He had prepared for the satisfaction of someone who wanted to see him humbled. He had prepared for tears, or for coldness, or for drama of some kind. He had not prepared for this, a woman who was entirely at peace. A woman who looked at him and felt, as far as he could tell, absolutely nothing except mild professional interest. It was, without question, the most uncomfortable moment of his life. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Sarah heard his proposal, asked sharp and specific questions, and then laid out her terms. They were not harsh terms. They were fair terms, the same kind she gave everyone. But they required real change from his side, structural change, the kind that would take apart systems he had spent years building. He pushed back on several points. She listened without rushing. then explained her reasoning so clearly that he could not find a hole in it. She was not fighting him. She was simply certain, in the way that people are certain when they have thought something through from every angle over a long period of time. He left that evening, with nothing signed but a promise to return. He returned 3 more times over the next 2 months. Each time, the conversation went deeper. Each time, he found himself spending the journey back thinking about what she had said. Not just the words, but the way she said them, the way she led, the way the people in her kingdom looked at her, with the particular ease of people who genuinely believe that the person in charge has their best interests at heart. He had never had that. He had had obedience. He had had respect built on caution. He had never had this quiet, uncomplicated trust. On his 4th visit, they sat in her garden in the late afternoon light, and he told her the truth. Not about the trade agreement. About himself. About the years he had spent being the kind of leader who confused control with strength. About what it had cost him, not in political terms, but in real terms. About watching the thing he had built slowly hollow out from the inside because it had been built on the wrong foundation. He did not ask her to forgive him. He knew that was not his to ask for. He told her that he had come the first time because his council sent him. He was coming back, he said, because he had not met anyone in a long time who made him want to be better at something other than winning. Sarah looked at the garden for a long time after he finished speaking. She thought about the girl who had walked through a palace gate in the rain 7 years ago. She thought about every choice she had made since then, not in regret, but in recognition. She had built something real. She had built it herself. Whatever happened next, that was true and would remain true. She turned to look at him. She studied his face, older now, quieter, with the particular expression of a man who has run out of reasons to pretend. She told him that she would not be leaving the Ember Kingdom, not for anyone, and not for anything. He said he understood. He asked, carefully, if he might be allowed to be part of what she was building instead. The ember in her chest, the one she had carried quietly for 7 years without ever acknowledging, flickered. She did not answer immediately. She looked back at her garden, at the herbs growing in neat rows, at the hills of the kingdom she had raised from almost nothing, at the life she had built on her own terms, and would never surrender. Then she said, simply and without drama, that they would see. It was not a yes, but it was not a no, and in the Ember Kingdom, where every agreement was made slowly, carefully, and with full respect for every party involved, it was the beginning of something. She had escaped a palace that was meant to contain her. She had built a kingdom that was entirely her own, and now, on her own terms, in her own time, she was deciding what came next. That, more than anything else, was the point.